So, Karnik and I, in person, had the idea. Well, I believe it was his idea, but we wanted to start doing roundtables for certain metaphysical discussion topics. Uh, Not only to just produce content that might be useful, helpful, and interesting, but also to, give everyone else, mostly you guys, a chance to engage with a certain subject matter. And today's roundtable is on avatar theory. Now, these notes will be a little bit schizophrenic, but I'm going to, let me see, can I zoom in? No. Because it's note taking. So, but hopefully this will be a little bit of a primer. I'll read anything relevant that was discussed, anything irrelevant that I gloss over, I'll just edit out of the video. But new terminology and roundtable, because avatar is kind of a loaded term. So if we can actually develop useful terms to get at the idea, then we should do that. But I guess I probably don't have like a good introduction to what it means, but by avatar it is meant basically an incarnation of a higher being, such as God himself or a particular god. Most people here are probably familiar with Arval maintaining Jesus is an avatar of God, and potentially Krishna as an earlier avatar of God. God himself, not like a particular henad or God, lowercase g. So that's like the basic idea. So some notes. First, Avatar not as God himself fully descended and incurring diminution. These are just ideas that can be discussed, so not really proclamations or anything. This is kind of similar to the matter in Platonism as to whether the soul is fully descended. If God had an avatar of himself, would that avatar be God, like fully descended, in such a way that it might diminish God on the higher order, or could that occur without diminution, that kind of direct descension, or does the whole thing have to be qualified in some way? The next one, avatar as a soul most proximate, as in a kind of like a direct descendant, like an ontological descendant of a certain being or God. Or to this, it says to the respective henad. This is the idea I'll kind of be putting forward, is like a conditional proximate, which only really works for particular gods that have conditions, because God in himself would be universal. So there would be no way, at least on the surface, to my thinking, we'll discuss this and we'll get some interesting thoughts. There'd be no way to discern one being's proximity to another except for maybe some particular that most perfectly encompasses the universality of God himself, or maybe lacks some of the kind of privatory negative attributes that are just defined by contraposition to like ontological attributes like goodness, justice. So that could be argued for in favor of Christ. And then we have a little diagram of what I'm talking about here. So take a god, a henad, or a direct ascendant or ancestor. Obviously not like a genetic ancestor, more like a conditional ancestor. And universals contain a lot of particulars and also cast themselves to a lot of particulars, instantiate themselves in a lot of particulars. So take all of these small circles as instances of those particulars. There could be one that is more directly in line with that universal, right? It would be the direct descendant, or proximate is the term I kind of just on the fly came up with. And these would be adjacent proximals, and this dotted line, suppose that's like the shadow, so to speak. Then everything outside that would be non-proximals. Just to give you guys an idea of what I meant by that. Another thing that can be discussed is avatar timing. Are they always there? Are they always incarnate? Do avatars, are they constantly incarnated? And are they always recognized when they are? Or can they be, such as is said with the myths regarding hospitality with Germanic and even Greek gods, can they kind of be incognito? Or do they only incarnate when necessary or when some conditional prerequisites are met? Like, does the world need to be a certain way to necessitate the incarnation of an avatar figure? Kind of like if you, like, suppose the world had to be a certain way for Christ to incarnate from like a Christian perspective, or perhaps more Arvolian perspective. Next set of notes. Okay, let's see. God in himself, avatar, as privatory relative to Hanatic God avatars, given they have discretion plus slash definition. Of course, I'm using Henad very broadly there. The Henads would not have this kind of definition, but that's another thought that I kind of touched on before, is that if you have an avatar of a universal, how would that not be privatory, or would it simply lack certain attributes that are in themselves privatory and only conceptually known of via contraposition to ontological attributes like goodness, justice, etc.? The innovation question. Okay, so Arval has this interesting idea that he deems as a mark of an incarnation or an avatar, which is that they will innovate, they will bring something new into reality, right? They'll introduce a new idea, and for Jesus, that would be mutual forgiveness. And I suppose, I'm not sure why I wrote what and to who, but like, oh yeah, I suppose like what the innovation would be, what would qualify as an innovation, and to who it's made could be relevant here. And another one, which was kind of interesting, I believe Karnak mentioned this, was anti-avatars. What and could there be one, or would or and could there be one, given it lacks a henad as the basis of its unity, however, given conditional reality is inherently self-definitive, reifying, contrary conditions might be defined and assumed. So an argument each way, basically. And that gets into the contraposition stuff I mentioned earlier. Let's see if there's anything else relevant here. Stalin seems like an anti-avatar. Okay, I don't think we added more notes. People put some of their own things, but I would like you guys to just kind of discuss that. All right, so did any of these, let's start with, did any of these stick out as something you have a position on? And we're going to do a roundtable such that it's more defined and you can pass if you'd like. But yeah, let me flesh that out. Did any of these stick out to you? Did you have a pre-existent position on any of these? And do you have any arguments in favor of it being either way? We'll do that before we actually start breaking down, like, by topic, some of those questions. And if somebody has other matters they think would be important relative to an avatar incarnation that they think should also be flushed out, then go ahead and bring that up. We will go counterclockwise like this because Karnak and I already talked a lot about it. So start with Celerillan. Do you have anything for us?
Yeah, I think the kind of like the one based on the diagram stands out to me. I think in the Ramayana, like the sort of origin story of how like Rama from it's if you're not familiar with what it is, it's like a Hindu epic essentially. Um, he incarnates as like fraction. Like I think there's some porridge and it's eaten by several different mothers. So Rama is like 2/3, and then it's different proportions fractionally, but it kind of all adds up to an incarnation of I don't know if it's Vishnu or certain deity. It's been a long time since I engaged with the text, but there is, I think, a sense mythologically there of a sort of gradation of incarnation. So that's been an interesting thing for me to point out. Do you want me to just speak or just to raise the topic? Meta.
I'll comment on that. That's also, yes, I like that, because if there was like a conditional avatar, like relative to a god that has some kind of condition, then it does make sense that there would be this graded proximity to it. Like someone could be not quite the direct proximate, but like very close as well. So I think that is a very good, important to raise, important matter to raise. That kind of diagram was touching on a little bit. All right, that's pretty good. Let's just get initial thoughts, and we can come back to that as well. That's a good. Okay, so you said the Brahmayana. That's in
the Ramayana.
Ramayana. Okay, yeah, Rama. Gotcha. All right, and then we'll go to Maitri. Would you like to speak?
Sure. One thing you said that kind of stuck out to me is you made a distinction between God lowercase g and God uppercase g. And is that like an assumption we're running with, that God and the gods are distinct, or could it be argued that there's not really a distinction between the two of them?
Well, we shouldn't assume it either way, but what I mean by that, so of course with like henads, they're kind of indistinct. There's like this virtual distinction with like plural henads in the first hypostasis, if I'm not mistaken. Does that sound like that's what Platonism holds? Something like that. However, my personal position is that the gods, plural, and I don't mean to say lowercase in like a disrespectful way, are the first like instances of conditioned beings, whereas God in himself would be completely unconditioned, or like being qua being of Aristotle. But metastructurally, they would, of course, be the same. It would be like a pluriform unity, is what I think of like the henads as, if that makes sense. And it's kind of like the myth seems to, like the way the gods relate to each other in myth, like all let's take like all the sexual relations and like incestuous stuff. It seems like that's not obviously trying to say it's virtuous, but rather it's demonstrating the like containment one has of another. But with the way I look at it, if you have not the most universal thing, but the most universal conditions, I'll clarify that conditions, if you have something that is a condition, it's defined, therefore not completely universal, but you can have like a most universal condition. And if I hold that the gods are that, then these most universal conditions would kind of have this containment and reciprocity of one another, kind of like how something that's defined in a way has the definition of what it is not, in order for it to be defined. So no, I wouldn't. I'm not going to assume anything like that, but that is my position. We can talk about that. That is relevant. So if you have a position on that, that would be relevant for the avatars.
Well, the way I think about it is each god is all the gods in power, and each god sort of contains the Godhead in a certain mode in a unique way. So the way I think about it is the gods aren't really distinct from God, because we know God through the gods, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, 100. Yes, that's very well said. Yeah. So like aspective monism, right? Like you have these aspects, but I would say that in order for an aspect to be defined against one another, you do have like you have the first increase in conditionality, which I think is the to your credit, the only way you can actually know the divine is with some sort of definition. So I definitely agree with the gods as aspects of the Godhead. Excuse me.
Yeah, when it gets to this, it can get kind of complicated to talk about because I sort of see God as like both a horizontal hierarchy of the gods and a vertical hierarchy of just godhood itself. So it can get pretty complicated.
Yeah. No, that's well said, though. I like the way you put that. And Linda, punished Linda, would you like to increase my viewer count by having a female voice in the video? You can pass if you want to. But I encourage you to be brave if you want to. It's up to you. And additionally, okay, well, if you want to speak on it later, feel free. Also, if you don't want to speak and you want to type things out while other people speak, I will get around to reading it. So if anybody, I do encourage people to speak though. So, all right, Raw Meat Enjoyer 91. Do you have anything to say on the matter?
Yes, how you were referring to just certain conditions and causalities that a avatar might incarnate. I'd like to also add, like, alongside that, especially with Krishna's case, going back into like the Indian framework, the Hindu framework of just how they perceive yugas, and essentially yugas can be seen as there's different properties of space time per yuga. And essentially, as the yugas continue, especially to this yuga, which they know as the Kali Yuga, they're everything is a lot more gross and dense compared to the earlier yugas. So naturally, the avatar represents the not only the collective consciousness, but the whole space time framework that he incarnates in. Krishna, for example, I would say is probably a more complete avatar. I guess if you'd like to compare that to Rama, even though that they are probably the same incarnation of the same God. Uh, Even just some of the things the miracles that he did. For example, he showed himself like devouring the whole earth, like swallowing it up, saying like the whole earth is within him. He would show multiple people within him at the same time. Like people could be looking at him, but they would see themselves and other people in his visage while he was. And this is why he was walking around in space time, and it just kind of also makes me like wonder: is there only one collective consciousness? Is there multiple collective consciousnesses? I'd have to say that I honestly think there's probably just one, and maybe there are maybe multiple like offshoots of that one. I mean, maybe like consider themselves separate, but actually aren't. And on top of that, like as far as anti-avatars go, even them, I don't even know if it would be even credible to even say they are an anti-avatar, because even so, they are still within Krishna.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So the first part, what I got, and just let me know if I'm following correctly, was difference in the manner of a spectuation, or you know, the mode the aspect takes on according to the difference of the world or age it takes on, especially if space time and the way it works is different. If we understand space time, let's say space as the information of relation between conditions and time as the registration of change in conditions, that would make interesting sense for that. So is that kind of what you're getting at?
Along those lines for sure. And it's like a more modern avatar that would reincarnate would be a lot less magical and spectacular nature, and more akin to the commonality of the day.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, so okay, so that kind of gets into like a actually a better, broader categorization of the what prerequisites have to be met, but more so how do they relate to the world, especially if we have something so universal as a god. There, it follows that there would be this manifold of ways in which they could appear, particularly it's actually just, I'm going to write this down. Another matter is agency of the descending god, because like whether they do it by inertia or agency is another matter, but that's a little bit irrelevant, so I'm just going to write that down for later. Yeah, that's actually a really good point, that you wouldn't expect the avatar to be contradictory to the world it's incarnating into, and they wouldn't be barred from some consistency therewith on account of the god being more universal enough to extend to many particulars. So that's a good point. On the collective consciousnesses thing, I think you can kind of have both. I think you can have a, like, okay, so take your consciousness, it's a very particular one. Let's say like one level higher, there's a broader collective consciousness. There's nothing really stopping that from being shelved into even broader collective consciousnesses and so on and so forth. So I think we on that matter we can have the cake and eat it too. It reminds me of morphic resonance, or at least that what I understand of morphic resonance. Is that kind of the idea of morphic resonance, Karnik?
Just that the paths that like anything follows is in the path of someone else who's already done it, and it's harder to carve out like a new path.
Okay, so kind of similar, but not the same thing. Okay, gotcha.
Would it be more apt to say that perhaps there was one collective consciousness, and as time passed, like there might have been a fragment, and that created another?
Oh, well, I still think there is like one, but it exists at like the most universal level of consciousness, and that contained within that you have increasingly particular levels of, well, I'm just gonna say soul, and then consciousness as like an operation of the soul. And that it exists right now, but you don't have direct access to it like constantly because you're involved with like particular sets of information, is what I would say on that. And now, Karnik, do you have anything to say on the matter?
Hello. So, just that whole idea of the avatar from Arval's perspective is a soul that incarnates with no karmic debt in its past. And another aspect of that is that as a, as a soul, there's so many infinite different ways that you could have lived your past lives to show up in this life as who you are. So what's really relevant is your immediate carnation. So what happened in your immediate karmic past. So that avatar figure has no karmic debt in his past. So in as many lifetimes as significant, which I'm not speculating on how long or short that is. It's not a recovering sinner that is the avatar. It is someone with no sin at all in their past that makes up who they are. So, yeah, that's one thing. So when we had the idea of the avatar, it's in a sense, if you want to think of the henads as a hierarchy, then at the top of the henads you have like Jove, Zeus. When you have an avatar with no karmic debt, then that's, essentially a Jovian, Zeusian person. And I think that's, the avatar in a sense. So the idea that there could be other avatars, like obviously, not obviously, but there seems to be a gap between avatars. So sometimes maybe they don't get noticed, or there is actually a gap. And I tend to think that there is a gap, and in that gap, so for there to be an avatar, certain requirements must be met. So in that gap between avatars, we get what I'm calling prophets, or essentially they're in this time. They are souls that have some sin in their karmic makeup, but it's less than all the rest of the people that they are incarnating around the same time. So that prophet would incarnate with a certain people, and they would, as R said, give them a philosophical insight that they need to further their civilization. So, like, for example, imagine an Asclepian soul that, his karmic makeup has some sin, but less than his peers, and his nature is so aligned with medicine or like disease, like a kind of physician type person. They might, I don't know, incarnate into a certain people that are in need of a, good physician, and that teaches them, some bandages or something that they need, right? And that makes those people a little bit better. And once the whole world, in a sense, gets those incremental incarnations, like the baseline karmic makeup of all the people on the world is at like a certain level, then the avatar might form. And so again, like an Arvolian thing, the avatar comes in, gives us some philosophical insight, and then can die for our sins. So, in a sense, he saves all the souls on that world from going to hell. In a sense, not like a literal hell, but like those souls would have just gotten worse and worse had that person not carnated, or that avatar figure carnated, and then died brutally for for their debt. And so that martyrism is like pretty enigmatic, and that's kind of what they yeah. June is yes.
Yeah, don't mind me. I'm just taking notes.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, for the anti-avatar thing, I don't think anti-avatar can be a thing, because, well, ours gave this like visual of, you can imagine like a light, like a ray of light shining straight down, and that's just one of those is the Jovian avatar, right? And then you can imagine like all the lights, like other rays of lights shining down like around that circle, could be your prophets, immediate avatars of the henads and stuff. And then every rung outside of that, you can continue like more circles of light coming down. Those would be like souls with more sin in their past, or like karmic debt. So there's no like direct there's not like one soul that's the most sinful. There'd actually be the last rung of this a lot of souls that are very sinful, and you have to raise these guys up to get that avatar figure again to carnate. That's about it for me.
Okay, interesting. So let me collect some thoughts on this. Okay, so it seems like and by the way, I'm hoping Arval will watch this, and then maybe we can get like a follow up to this and like include Arval. But this we can think of this as maybe like whetting his appetite to join in on one of these discussions. Because obviously this is something Arval talks about a lot. But it seems like there's a conditional buildup to of like fulfilling prerequisites for the incarnation to take place, and in the meantime you have people approaching proximity to that or to that prerequisite, which in the case in the Arvolian model is a clean karmic debt or a lack of karmic debt. So I would be curious as to what constitutes karmic debt. Is it, because it can't just be, or maybe it can be, but to my mind, it doesn't seem like it would just be like lack of involvement in conditions, but maybe a lack of reifying them, or it could be. But another question this raises is like whether it's this process to getting to the point as posited in that model of an incarnation, whether it's kind of mechanistic and it'll just happen via some inertial process, or if it's kind of like observed and there's like agency, like take for example, like God is observing and waiting for these prerequisites to be fulfilled, and then incarnates as an avatar once they are. But no, wait, no, okay, because you say the model is it's basically like, and correct me if this is wrong, but anyone can kind of become an avatar so long as they are not recovering from a karmic debt and they actually have like this clean slate.
Right. By like striving to be like the avatar, you have less and less sin in your karmic history. Eventually, if you keep that up, you go so many lives without sinning, and you could do the avatar thing.
Okay, interesting. So you can increase your proxy. Okay, that makes sense, because I think, like, suppose with it might be a little bit more approachable with like a particular something we conceive of as like particular God. It makes sense that as a soul that can change its condition, has the agency to do so, you could increase your proximity towards that being such that like you would essentially embody the condition of that being on a particular level. But how this works with God and himself, or the Godhead, is a little more complex, but very interesting. So, okay, and prophets as approaching that proximity is also super interesting. And to my mind, even like worship and kind of like our conversation about theurgy, how that's like, we talked about how certain modes of theurgy or you told me about how certain modes of theurgy are kind of like increasing your proximity to like ancestors, for instance. Well, like worship of a god and certain rites and rituals might be an increase in proximity with that god. It may be like a very, not like introductory increase of proximity, but not like at the level of like a prophet or an incarnation. Oh yeah, before I forget, let me add, this one might be fun because I'm sure everyone will have interesting takes on this, but possible, and we're not going to do this right now, okay, we'll get to this, but possible instances of incarnations of different gods. Gods or the Godhead. Okay, we'll talk about that later. That'll be fun. I forgot to write that down in the notes section. But all right, yeah, the Arval model seems we have the Arval model, but we will not suppose that we have the full thing. Hopefully, we will get that from him at some point. Now, okay, real quick, if you're in like the watching section and you want to participate in the discussion, I know Gilded's kind of weird, but you have to click like the speaker or something, and you can join in the talking section if you'd like. And yeah, does anybody? I'll give a minute, because Noverman, if you want to join in and do like an introductory statement or position, it's pretty free form, so it's not like you have to have anything prepared. If you have any thoughts, you want to join in and relay those, then you can wait a moment. But while I do that, what would be a good way to further this would be models. And I'm going to go ahead and give my model a little bit more specifically. Of course, I kind of already did, and we have the Arval model, like ways we think this may occur if we have arguments. Actually, I'm going to touch on the anti-avatar thing because, yeah, I do think, in a sense, I believe Damascus says this, negation is not predication. So if you have something that's like a negative image of something else, or simply just does not embody those conditions, it doesn't like actually reify it to be something antithetical to that thing, only conceptually. So yeah, I do agree there could be no actual like anti-avatar, but the closest thing would be like some reified antithesis to that, but it wouldn't actually be like an ontological status rendered to that thing, especially if that thing implies like being itself. Then it would be heavily like concept reified, this like instance of non-being, which there could be interesting takes on, I suppose. It seems like Arval thinks AI is, and that kind of makes sense. It's like this reified non-being that's almost like convincing people of its sentience already, even. But in any case, models. So the way I think this occurs, again, I apologize, this is going to be a little bit repetitive. Hold on. So I think I really like the potential for some being at a lower scale to be able to increase its proximity. I think that's a good argument, especially in respect to conditional gods or conditioned gods. Gods that have a way that are relative to other gods that have a different way that they are. So definition by negation in some sense, because we do change our conditions. So I do think, however, that if you have more universal conditions on high, they will also by default cast themselves down, because those are the universal conditions that particular conditions are working with to compose and be arranged with, and relative to individual or more particular souls assuming conditions. So I think that you have this kind of emanation of conditions when you have the introduction of sets of information or conditions in reality. And I think that you have a series of this occurring. Like, for instance, if you think daimons are, let's say, like one conditional scale above human souls, one increase in universality, I should say. This scale is, this conditional scale at the top, universal conditions, the bottom, particular, right? So one increase in universality might be like daimonic souls, not in like the negative sense, like maybe eudaimonic, kakodaimonic, probably both. And yeah, so you'd have it through the whole series, and then you'd have even like a human that's in the closest proximity to like this daimon, or maybe you'd want to say angel, that's fine. Like direct in that series, like direct descendant thereof. So I think that is a thing. However, conditions do change. So whether a particular soul would stay in that series is another matter entirely, but I think it kind of would. But that's how I think it occurs. I think that you would have human souls that are the most proximate to, let's say, the condition of a god, but it wouldn't be complete without those other increasing or decreasingly proximate souls as well, because they kind of represent other aspects of that god, because a universal would cast itself to multiple particulars. So in a sense, you can have, like we touched on earlier, this graded or gradient of proximity to a universal condition in which you have like this direct proximate. Also, if anyone else has terminology, because I do think avatar is potentially a little bit ambiguous. I'm going to go with proximate, although I'm going to use avatar for the whole video probably. Let's see. How does being an avatar differ from enlightenment or henosis, or are they the same? Now, that's an interesting question, and I believe Arval has actually talked about this, because I think somebody asked him about the difference between, I believe it was Buddha and Christ, or a bodhisattva and like a Christ figure. And I believe the answer he gave was that one, or something to the effect of one is coming down and one is going up, right? One is kind of coming top down and one is going bottom up. So one kind of, however, yeah, actually, if a soul is, if it's a karmic debt thing, would that make sense though? Karnic?
Yeah, okay. So, like, answer that enlightenment question. I've been thinking about this a little bit. And, all right, so in a sense, it is enlightenment because you are eliminating your karmic debt. So, in a sense, you aren't, your life's getting better and better. All your incarnations are getting better. There's like a theory where souls, after they like do something, maybe this avatar thing, they become daimonical entities, like non-corporeal entities. I don't really subscribe to that, honestly. I think that souls exist on the level of souls, and you're not gonna get out of that, and just kind of accept it. But what Ars just said about, you have one path that's going up, right, towards enlightenment, and the other one's kind of coming down. This kind of implies that, so you're the avatar, you go and you die on the cross, right? Or you get lit on fire or something really bad, you sacrifice yourself. And then what does the avatar do in its next incarnation? Assumedly start sinning again. Assumedly you're pretty disgruntled about that, and or yeah, you start sinning again. You could try to balance this out with like a many worlds thing. So once you reach that level of avatarness, you keep incarnating in different worlds, doing your thing. But yeah,
that's an excellent point, because you have to have, in order to not be recursively affected by something that happens to you, because what you experience does like affect your soul, right? So in order to not be recursively affected by your surroundings, there needs to be something barring that. So another question that could be good is whether the avatar retains basically like this high level of agency, such that it's simply not being attached to these object conditions, like, for instance, the saturation of having been burnt alive, for instance, or something bad happening to you, such that it's like defining who you are. Because agency in the soul kind of exists beside the set of information saturating the soul. It doesn't like exist, like pure agency does not exist in reference to that set of conditions. So maybe that could, like an avatar, if someone like reaches true enlightenment, it could be postulated that this retention of agency at the highest level in corporeal reality is something that is retained after death, and it's not like accidentally lost. Like maybe it's something that, like suppose we have like this kind of agnosis, like you and I in conditional reality, we have this kind of agnosis where we have forgotten the agency and live heavily in reference to our own inertia. I have 2 articles about this, but hopefully it makes sense. We exist heavily in reference to our own inertia, but perhaps once that agency is realized, which would be quite divine, it's not something that's like lost. And in fact, it might be something that is necessary to descend in order to attain, because agency is kind of contraposed against inertia, particularly in conditional, phenomenal, material reality, right? We have something to define it against now, so we kind of have a vantage point. So that could also credit something like that. But that is a really interesting point. Like, how does suffering not affect the soul of an avatar such that it decreases its proximity to something that would not be suffering? So it like kind of sounds like we should just have Arval in here. But
an interesting thing to think about with that is like, I know like God as God absolute is very incomparable in a lot of senses, but still I think it's helpful if like there are senses in like whatever Christ is, whatever we're taking him to be as an avatar, probably has some similarities with like a like lowercase g, a hanatic God incarnation. And Christ suffered quite profoundly, but there's a sense of overcoming it. Like that, like agential will does not get infringed upon by circumstantial conditioning. Like in that descent, there's a mastery over it, which I
right.
think you could probably say is a characteristic more broadly too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do think that would be quite potentially like a strong point in favor of that. And it could also tie into what will, this isn't exactly relevant to that, but another matter that was on the notes was the incarnation of a Godhead, and the Godhead, of course, being like completely universal, non particular, right? Incarnating in a very particular world, in a particular arrangement. This seems that it would either, we would either have to have some mechanism to explain that or some agency in God to like actually choose, and it doesn't like actually define the character of, let's say, the Son, Christ. Like there is like particular conditions surrounding him, but let's say that these object conditions are not things that he's actually attached to and not like ultimately defining him, just like the suffering. The karmic debt thing is also very interesting for this because it's not, yeah, like I said, it seems to not get into like a lack of conditions, but perhaps a lack of attachment to the conditions or reification of the conditions to themselves, because we would need like an explanation on precisely what is meant by sin, particularly for the Arval model. But I'm assuming it seems to me that sin is a consequence of object reification. Like, even take like the 7 deadly sins, they seem to be like over involvement in these object conditions. And what happens when you're over involved in object conditions is they are saturating your memory, or what I call the soul's mnemonic capacity, kind of defining what the soul is going to be, to exist in reference to. So like greed is kind of obvious, right? Desiring after more objects, gluttony, same thing, lust, basically the same thing. These are all like inertial things, like operating in reference to inertia. Like you have like this impulse towards these things without thinking of it, generally speaking. So yeah, maybe that would be a good explanation for why something so universal could incarnate so particularly. So Arval, if you're watching that or this, that would be, we would like to hear about that because that would be interesting. Does anybody have thoughts on like the like Godhead avatars as opposed to particular God avatars? Because I think that's a good point of discussion.
Yeah, I would like to know, like, where's the distinction? Like, let's take two figures, for example, where, you have Jesus, who is pretty much a born, manifestation, and like Krishna, a born manifestation, versus mantled avatars. A lot of people say Alexander the Great was a avatar of Dionysus. Muhammad, for example. Like I think it kind of coincides with what Karnak was saying about the Buddha going up and like going down. But also, you have to take into account that like a lot of people consider Buddha an avatar of Vishnu as well.
Right. I think it would be like a process distinction, but not an distinction in the achievement or the result. You know what I mean? Like it could be that if you are not an avatar, if you're not like the direct proximate to this more universal God embodying this more universal condition, but you mantle that condition or the particular proximate to that universal, it would be a difference in process, but not in result, right? If, like when it's achieved, it would be the same thing, I think.
Gotcha.
And it sounds like Matri, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, the way I think of the Godhead isn't a particular god like Jove. I think the Godhead is the apophatic nature of the gods. So each god contains this unconditioned nature or with no definition in a unique way. So you come close to that nature through the different gods. That's how I see the Godhead. The Godhead isn't a being that flows, but is flow itself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think we're basically all on the same page as far as the distinction between the Godhead being completely unconditioned, non-particular, and the gods being like the first increase in particularity of that Godhead, or the primary espectuation of that Godhead. And it makes sense that you would go from like immediately one Godhead, of course, to like this pluriform, like multi-instantiated number of God, not like one single God next in the line of procession, then a bunch, because as soon as you have like one aspect, you recursively have several. So I do kind of like there was this sculpture, now there's just like a picture of it. It's like some people make fun of it and call it like an ashtray, but it's the 12 Olympians around this altar, around this circle that is supposed to represent the one. But yeah, so I'm assuming that you would, based on what you said, not think that there would be an avatar of the apophatic Godhead, but rather of like the particular gods or aspects thereof.
No, it wouldn't make any sense to me because you're essentially saying that there's an avatar that doesn't contain divinity in any particular way. And like how would that be possible?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, especially in the particular world. So that's kind of what I'm trying to draw out of this, is if there is any line of argument for, like, for instance, Christ is posited to be the son of like the God, like the Godhead.
Well, he identifies himself as Yahweh. Like he says he has his divine name. So my thoughts would be he's an avatar of Yahweh specifically.
Right. Okay. So so you think that they're like Yahweh is a particular God and not like actually getting at the Godhead, which, yeah, I think that's potentially fair. I'm not like a Christian myself, but I am open to arguments. But I think that is a good argument, is it's basically, how does the most universal non-particular thing particularize itself such that everything else around it, all these other particulars, are actually contrary to it when it is the most universal thing? You would think that it would be non-privatory in that way. So well, let me ask another thing, because I think this is another thing worthy of topic, is do you think that in the, like, let's say the 12 Olympians, would one of them potentially be the direct, the more direct aspect of the Godhead? Like, for instance, I do think some Platonist authors kind of held Jove or Yahweh to be either like this direct aspect, or sometimes I think they just say that Yahweh is representing the Godhead. But do you think that there could be a direct instantiation of the Godhead amongst the gods, or not really, because that would, particularize it too much?
I don't really think so, because Jove is the leader of is the king of the pantheon because he orders the different modes of being, but that is the way he contains the unique way he contains the divinity of the Godhead. So it's not that he's superior to any of the other gods. He just orders them in a correct way. So that's how I think about it. I don't really see the gods as necessarily more divine or more closer to the Godhead than the other, because as we said before, each god is all the gods in power. So even Jove himself, each god contains a jovial aspect, if that makes sense. So it wouldn't really make sense to make this distinction between any of the gods.
Right. I've heard it said each is in each, but appropriately in each. Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good position. I'm glad that was brought up. All right. Let's circle around for more. Celarillin, I'm sure you have thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's a rather difficult issue to kind of really postulating an incarnation of the absolute, or like God qua God in any way, but also you're not really reading Christianity properly if you're not doing that. So as a Christian, I would maintain that, but like I think the best way I can like justify that rationally is in a sort of there's a sense that like kind of as Maitreyi and such are talking, like in any particular god, there's the instantiation of like the absolute, the like the undifferentiated. There can be that unconditioned nature within a particular thing. Just it has, you know, the conditions added on top of it, which gives it its instantiation and such. But one way of looking at Christ, for example, as an avatar of like God, would perhaps be sort of as demonstrating this inherent presence of the absolute within the particular in a very pronounced way. It might be more perceptual. If we do take, you know, mind as arche and such, this isn't just like a reduction either. But like Christians like to talk about the mystery of a lot of things, the mystery of the Trinity and such. I don't think the Trinity is actually that mysterious, but the incarnation kind of has to be, or else it's just another mystical happenstance, you know.
Okay, I think that's interesting. So let me see if I'm following. So okay, the Godhead, just as the Godhead is in the gods, the Godhead would likewise be in the preceding, like increasingly particular beings as well. And there could be some kind of like realization of this like absolute nature in the individual, which would be kind of similar to the Arvolian, you know, cleaning of the slate of karmic debt potentially. Okay. So it would be like maybe incarnation would actually be an inappropriate word, but similar to that, but it's not predicated on conditions at all, perhaps more so predicated on realization of the absolute in the individual, which would almost seem to suggest that there would be no casting down of the absolute in particular, because then it would private the absolute, but rather there can be realization of the absolute in the individual. Is that kind of, am I following your suggestion correctly?
I'm not sure, because I would say that like there is kind of a descent in the incarnation. Like, sorry, the words are escaping me when I'm put on the spot.
It's all right. So descent, like, would you say if there's daimonical souls, there would be like this absolute daimon sort of incarnate?
In a way, it's that Christ, for example, if we do take him as like absolute incarnation, there's it's a very particular like willed instantiation within particular reality. Kind of like to see the incarnation as a model of creation generally. Where like God becoming man as Christ is pretty much the same process as, for example, the manifestation of the universe. God like self-defining, becoming man.
Okay. So okay, I think I'm following. Let me see if I am. So suppose you had like a dream of a massive scale, and then you basically made up a character to play in that dream, but you making up the character doesn't necessarily delimit or particularize your essence. You simply just have the power to do that. Is that closer?
I think it can work, and then it gets into the distinction of what would make Christ, for example, more of a player character than just another guy walking around in the game.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be another thing. It is an interesting possibility though, and I was thinking something along those lines as a possibility for an absolute incarnation, and just not having the conditions actually delimit the absolute, or diminish the absolute, and it would
Like
just,
this weird paradox at the heart of it, where you have to have the conditions applied. Like, Christ has to be a man to be really Christ in a meaningful sense.
right.
And yet there's this like fecundity, I guess, of Christ as a person. He's really sort of described as partaking in different essences of many gods. Obviously Dionysus, the
Right, yeah, I've
wine
heard that one.
symbol. There are so many parallels you can make in many different places. The Jovian aspect is pretty pronounced, obviously, in like most Christian circles. There's a fullness in the particular instantiation, which sort of bears the image of an absolute sense.
Right,
Almost
like a particular that most encompasses the universal insofar as a particular can, but perhaps the soul of that incarnation is not so delimited as the form it's assuming.
yeah, even perhaps saying that like within that particular there is the potential for the infinite. But there's ultimately the conditions are illusory for any individual soul is an instantiation of the absolute.
Okay, so this kind of gets into the agency of the Godhead. Does the Godhead have agency in the way we think of it? And I find that interesting. I also find this kind of, I think the self-realization thing is probably the most immediately possible. It's kind of like the Pythagorean maxim, or maybe it's not a maxim, excuse me, but there's something that's attributed to Pythagoras along the lines of man has one foot in time and the other in eternity. Like you could be rooted in this realization of absoluteness while still participating of particulars, because the particulars, I mean, if you realize, for instance, that you are just a soul, and the soul has a metastructure that exists like without respect to conditions, the ability to take on conditions is just something that is baked into that metastructure. But and that's why it's a metastructure, right? A structuring structure. It can take on any number of structures or sets of information without those sets of information actually diminishing what the metastructure is. Just like all of you have a different mental pattern than I, but you and I have a base mental metastructure that is identical. Their minds, right? At some level, they are the exact same. So yeah, that's, I think, could be very convincing, is this self-realization aspect. So I'm wondering if Arval would agree with that, with the kind of karmic debt, or maybe the karmic debt would kind of incur a similar process, the karmic debt being cleared, that is. Let me call on Karnik, because I believe you may have something to say about this.
I should have been taking notes, but I did. I did have something to say about that. I agree, and I would like I said earlier about it being like the Jovian or like Zeusian avatar figure to it being like the Godhead itself, and that yeah, all the divinities are essentially on the same level with just different powers.
Yes, interesting. Um, yeah, this might. What I'm thinking is we should revisit this at some point. Not that hasn't been productive. I actually really enjoy this, but I kind of want to get Arval in for the next one if we can. Um, Another reminder: if anybody's in the watching section wants to join in and talk, or even just type, I will read it out loud if you're not going to talk. Raw meat enjoyer, let's go to you.
I had
Or Karnak, yeah.
one topic. Yeah, sorry. I had one thing on my notes that we kind of brought up, which was like how to become the avatar and getting rid of your karmic debt could be being, you know, like a practical way to achieve that would be becoming more unified with yourself. And when I say that, I mean when we trust our senses, right, our sight and our hearing and stuff like that, it's basically a message that gives us that, like, it's a feedback loop that talks to our biological imperative to survive. And we're constantly in a cycle of what do I do next? What do I do next? What do I do next? And these streams of sensory info are trying to answer that perpetual question, that like multitude in us. But to be more divine, we have to have the unity in ourselves, and thus we have to kind of ignore our sense data as much as possible. Obviously, we shouldn't like do it too much, but that's the point of aestheticism, is not aestheticism in itself, but the kind of escaping from that biological cycle that we're in and trying to be more like unitary of mind, hence more defined.
Yeah, that also I keep bringing on up Jonathan Roth's, but one of his videos is about like dissociated consciousnesses within like an individual, which would kind of speak to the opposite. I'm not. It doesn't contradict your point. That's not what I mean. More so like that would be the opposite of doing that. Is you'd be like more fragmented in your being rather than unitive. So basically, sublating any aspects within a unified whole and like kind of yoking them all together dialectically is what I'm getting from that, and not being overly involved in particulars, because in so doing you like phenomenal reality is kind of like a reifying process, the process of like object orientation as conditioned souls. Like we naturally reify objects and internalize them into this set of information comprising our soul in some way. And because it's particularizing and reifying, it kind of becomes compartmentalizing, right? Like we have all these different things, not necessarily sublated within a greater whole. So maybe you could do that, or you could simply disubjectify or dissociate with all of the particulars, and that would kind of bring you in the train, so to speak, or trajectory of a more unitive existence. And raw meat.
Yeah, actually, Karnak really touched on what I was about to bring up as far as like a Unitarian concept, because it seems that the one prefers some type of homogeneity, whether it be through different variables, not necessarily like a homogeneous people, but like maybe like a homogeneous belief or a homogeneous disposition. And being that peoples are so fragmented nowadays, and that well, the propensity of sin is much more higher, either because of this or other factors, that the times between the avatar incarnating would probably be longer. So because it's not everything is as pure, not everything is as uniform, not everything is united. Essentially, we don't know what we want as a species. I believe that plays a part and on the length of time to where we get to see an avatar.
Interesting. Yeah, I was also thinking individuation while Karnak was talking. Wait, can you repeat the time, the like time length between avatars and what causes that real quick? Cause actually, I wanna get that down more.
Like the time length between avatars is increased due to the fragmentation of peoples, the fragmentation of beliefs, the fragmentation of dispositions.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting position too. That could be a prerequisite. Is there needs to be some unitive potential. I was gonna say potential for that to happen. As a possibility, a covenant, or perhaps the need for it. If there's agency in the process and it's not mechanistic. If it's mechanistic, that would make sense, and it can be not in like necessarily what we first think of when we think of like mechanical operations, but something that would just naturally occur because XYZ has been fulfilled. Being deserving of a covenant. Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's an interesting position as well, because I was actually worried we weren't going to get into any like or any more like time length speculation. I'm reviewing my notes real quick. Does anybody
There's one thing on that topic. I think my screen refreshed. Sorry about that. Yeah, just on that topic, like in my opinion, it would be, since God is always good and doesn't change, which are like rules from the Republic. There would be always someone trying to make the world better. So in like this current world where things seem kind of messed up, there's still good people trying to get people to accept philosophical innovations. And that's like that's how I took the covenant. Like there is God's always acting in this world in the way that is possible, but souls here are more forgetful than they do remember. So that's how, as a world, we seem to be descending. But the world at large is just a reflection of your individual soul. So if your soul gets better, the world would get better over time. You'd essentially leave this place.
Right. So that seems to be in the same vein as like the prophets. There's like always going to be some souls that are in some degree proximate to that. We can even just say the good, for instance, like the Platonic good. Even if there's no epitome or like pinnacle thereof. And in that way, the god would be acting.
It makes sense too if there's like more casual, more diluted, if you will, presence of like particular Hanatic gods present as just like at work through various people. You don't need to have a particular avatar sort of relationship or instantiation yourself to exercise Asclepian virtues, for example, which would manifest the god in a way of looking at it.
Oh yeah,
on a lesser
absolutely.
state.
Yeah, it's almost like there's almost like a different sense of the concept of summoning, in that like increasing your conditional proximity to either the good or a god is almost like summoning that god into the world to a greater degree and in a certain modality. according to the like condition you're embodying to do that. So it's almost like pursuing this kind of mantlement or mantling process is also like a summoning process. Of course, don't take summoning like too colloquially there, like not like conjuration in Skyrim or something, but you know what I mean. That's interesting too. Yes, to bring forth. Yeah, indeed. So yeah, Skyrim references. Hell yeah. Okay. Now before I pick through the notes, does anybody have further thoughts on this that they want out now? No. We're going to save the fun or speculation about like who may have been an avatar and of what god. But let me see first. Okay, the innovation question that I mentioned earlier. For instance, Arval holds that one sign of such an avatar, and we're just going to go ahead and apply this to like an avatar of any god, is that they will have a philosophical innovation. Of course, I think he primarily focuses on like the avatar of God himself, right? The Godhead. And Jesus's would be mutual forgiveness. What do you guys think of that as like an identifier? And can you think of any other instances? Yeah, know them. Yeah. Do any of you have any thoughts on that, or do you know of any fruits that would suggest other possible instances of avatars? It's a tough one because actually like figuring out where a concept originates is easier said than done.
I'd imagine it's kind of just like a kind of akin to like a mechanic or a technician. Like God kind of just sees what's needed, and like what is the symptom, and he brings forth the avatar and essentially remediates that said symptom.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if we have like some kind of agency on high. But I think that's another matter entirely that could be discussed later. Is like what would like divine agency look like? Of course, I would be hesitant to private something like universal agency or any attribute in its universal form, in which it would not be isolated in the Godhead or the Absolute. But it would be key to explaining like how some of these things might work. But that could also be mechanistic, ironically. Sorry, Karnik, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, nothing much to add on this besides people consider, I guess, Krishna, or there was a Hindu person that was considered another avatar, and I am very curious what their philosophical innovation would have been.
That is a good question. Actually, Rami, you are probably pretty well read on this. Do you have like any speculation? I feel like Maitri might also.
Are you referring to Rama?
Very possibly.
If it was the one that Silurian mentioned, yes. Rama, he essentially brought peace to the kingdom that was being besieged by the Demon King. And although like the Demon King, there was particulars about the Demon King that like his subjects liked, and that he wasn't like totally bad, but he essentially disrupted a cosmic balance, and Vishnu saw this from his heavenly abode and incarnated to essentially bring about a balance. Because this Demon King was actually blessed by Shiva, and it gave him a divinities that he otherwise would not have had.
I see. Is there any? Okay, so Rama is said to be an incarnation of Vishnu, right?
Yes.
Is there anything in like what's the term? I'll just say Hinduism. I kind of forget. Oh, yeah, Sanatana Dharma. Is there anything therein because I'm not super familiar with it, that says like Krishna is an avatar of, I suppose, Brahman.
Well, Brahma is probably the absolute, whereas like I'd assume Vishnu might be a little bit more particular, but Vishnu is Brahma, Brahma is Vishnu, Krishna is Vishnu, Brahma by extension, and Rama to you could say to a lesser extent, but I would doubt even that. Also alongside all of them as well, and Shiva is an offshoot of Brahma.
So there's like is there a triad, or is it actually more pluriform than a triad? It seemed like there was a triad for a
There's
second.
probably a little bit more, but I'm sure some people would even say that it's just a triad, or
Okay,
or it's
interesting.
like maybe there's 3 under Brahma,
Right.
rather than
And there's a
4.
distinction between Brahman with an N at the end and Brahma, correct?
Well, a Brahmin is a priest of Brahma.
No, I mean, hold on. Not okay. So there's. I'm gonna type it out.
I think you're right about this, yeah.
Brahman, and then Brahmin, which is the caste, and then Brahma, right, is like a god. Actually, hold on. Let me just.
Yeah, I think Brahman is Brahma.
Okay, yeah, because usually Brahman is the highest universal principle, ultimate reality, and then Brahma is the creator god. Almost maybe like a demiurge absolute distinction, and includes Vishnu and Shiva. Okay, so there's a Trimurti. Okay. Well, at least according to Wikipedia, I won't no, whoops, not that. I won't take that without a grain of salt. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay. Interesting. So right. Okay. So let's see. Innovation. So anybody else have potential like innovations, philosophical innovations, just because we're investigating the Arval proclamation on the matter?
Well, I mean, Jesus Christ was definitely type of moral innovations.
Right. Yeah, and he says the moral
Christianity
innovation that or the primary moral innovation that Christ brings is mutual forgiveness. By the way, slightly tangential, but Neville Goddard has really interesting takes on this. It seems like okay, so when you go like back into potentially history, but it's kind of like shrouded in mythic lore with like Orpheus, it seems like he's said to have brought musical innovations which may have bearings on metaphysics, especially if it's allegorical. So that's kind of interesting, and this is kind of just bringing us to the topic of like potential avatar speculation. It seems like Orpheus is very related to Dionysus. In fact, he like basically repeats the Dionysus myth by going into the underworld to save his wife. Although I think he eventually, like, that kind of turns on him. He eventually gets killed by Maenads, which are female priestesses of Dionysus. Seems like a pretty good way to die. You know what I mean? But and most ancient lore seems to hold Orpheus proximal to Dionysus. However, I think like the oldest record, according to Wikipedia, says that he had a peculiar association with Apollo as well. But if there's like this kind of dynamic between the two, that could also make sense, especially if we take into consideration the Pythagorean perspective on Apollo, and we note that Orphism is, you know, very proximal to Pythagoreanism. I will answer. Okay, you're in the watching section. Okay, because you're heading out. Thanks for joining in, by the way. You brought up some really good points. Can prophets be prophets without knowing it? I would say. Oh, he left. Okay, we'll revisit that. Where was I? Orpheus. Oh yeah, the Pythagoreans had this take on Apollo because Apollo means, I mean, like strictly etymologically, it can mean not many because a as a prefix just means not. It's a negation of the following, and Apollyon means many or plural. So the Pythagoreans seem to hold Apollo to be basically akin to the one or the Pythagorean monad. So that could make sense for a relationship with Apollo as well as Dionysus. So that's one speculation. I mean, we also, to kind of get into the obvious, Hermes Trismegistus, if he is a historical figure at all, or whether it's even relevant that they're historical if we have certain metaphysics of the past in mind. He was basically directly noted to be like an incarnation, the third Hermes or the thrice greatest. So there's Hermes Trismegistus, which may be Hermeticism, ancient Hermeticism. I mean, all we really have of like the like original Hermeticism is basically the Emerald Tablet. As above, so below seems to. I don't know if there's like any older reference to that, although it's probably pretty likely that that was an older idea. But that is in the Emerald Tablet, which is just like 1 page long, and I don't know how old it actually is, but yeah. And anybody else have any potential avatar speculation, guys? Jesus Christ obviously is like seen. I mean, obviously we talked about Arvol's model and for being an avatar of the Godhead rather than a particular god.
So there was
I think
Alexander the Great.
Oh, you guys talked at the same time.
I'm sorry, I was just saying Alexander the Great mantling Dionysus.
Alexander the Great mantling Dionysus. Okay, interesting. And what's kind of the lore behind his association with Dionysus and why it would be Dionysus as opposed to, say, like Ares?
I'm not really sure. I'd have to investigate a little bit more. I just know it's something that's commonly said.
Okay, investigate we will at some point. Are there any other ones? Okay, like I feel like a lot of the conquerors are kind of at least deified. For instance, like I believe Augustus and Julius. Ares prophet. Yeah. Okay. Well, and before that goes out of hand, guys. Okay. I don't know what you're typing. We're we're not gonna we're gonna avoid talking about that. Okay.
On that question that Maytree left, I'm not sure they wouldn't necessarily know. They would be, I would imagine, more intelligent or able to come up with these philosophical innovations. So I would say it's not necessary that they know that they're a prophet, just that they would seem that way to others. And I know that's kind of bleeding into the question of can there be in like an avatar prophet kind of incarnation that doesn't get noticed. So
True.
I'm
Yes, that's an excellent
to.
question. That and also would an avatar by default like cognize discursively that he or she is an avatar, or would it simply like be just default to their nature and they wouldn't like have to cognize, oh, I am Yahweh, I am oh, I'm Mars. So that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure.
How much of a hand does the collective consciousness have in calling an avatar or even creating an avatar? Because they almost actually seem to coincide with most of like the text and cultural norms that from the collective consciousness that they're from most of the time. Like usually they're prophesized ahead of time and they coincide in such a way where it's maybe it's not a predestination, more as just a will of the collective consciousness to bring them forth.
That's also
That's
a
a
good
good one.
point. Yeah. Collective summoning is kind of like an impetus that a society or group of people is on, bringing an incarnation or like priming the worldscape or noosphere or whatever for an incarnation. Shakespeare as a Mercurian avatar. Yeah. That's a good.
That reminds
That
me of.
seems. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
You're
No,
good.
yeah, my bad. Pythagoras was like foretold as being born from the Delphic oracle, so probably Pythagoras as an Apollonian
Oh yeah,
prophet.
I can't believe I forgot about that. Yeah, yeah, and there's in the Pythagorean source book. So I don't know. I'm pretty sure Porphyry is the one telling the story, but like a Scythian priest went to Greece to find Pythagoras because he was like aware that there was like an incarnation of his equivalent of Apollo, which is interesting because Apollo is like said to be the god of the north wind or the a hyperborean god. So that's yeah, Pythagoras, and there is Pythagoras also has miracle stories as well. Like I believe it's literally actually walking on water as well, or like yeah, he walked over this river in front of this like Scythian guy or something like that. So that's yeah, that's a good one. Thank you for bringing that up. Um, Apollonius of Tyana seems like an interesting miracle worker. I don't know too much about Apollonius of Tyana, but he seems. I think one of the miracles that Apollonius, and I'm not sure which god he would potentially be in proximity of. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, maybe Apollo, but uh, I, as I recall, he was credited with bilocation, which is being in two locations at once, and I believe Pythagoras is also credited with that.
A lot of the Tibetan lamas and Avalokiteshvara are also a product of predestination. There were many visions, and even down to the point where monks would receive premonitions from deities about where the next lama would be born and to who.
Oh yeah, I've heard of things like that. Okay, so that actually gets back into your last point is this could be a good qualifier for avatars as well, alongside the philosophical innovation matter is actually whether okay, because your last point was basically like collective summoning or like priming the conditions for an incarnation, right? Via this like unconscious collective summoning, which it would follow that there could be like not predestination, like uh foretold or prophecy surrounding the birth of such an incarnation, which also follows for like Christ, I believe. I'm not like super steeped in Christian lore. So that is interesting. I think that would be like a good perennial qualifier for identifying them, perhaps. Okay, because those, and of course, like it wouldn't necessarily have to be. I think you could have avatars for. Suppose like the Hanadic gods also have like their own pluriform spectuation just posterior to that, and like there was something to tribal gods having like discrete usias, perhaps. I'm not saying this with any like concretion, it's speculation, but it does make sense that you would have like like increasing particularization, and then maybe just after like the first particular gods, you have increasingly particular. Therefore, you have like this pluriform god that's sublated within like the henad of that god. But there's like multiple aspects of it, so on and so forth. So you could potentially have avatars of a great number of things in the series. Like if there was this aspect of a god, perhaps you have an avatar of that aspect arising at a certain time in certain conditions as well. Okay, so I like that. That's interesting. The whole point of Israelite religion is being a people set apart, the people of the absolute as opposed to particular powers gods. You could view their entire history as a preparing of the conditions for Christ, and Christians tend to do so. Interesting. Celerilla, do you want to speak more to this train of thought?
Yeah, sure. I gotta go soon because my battery's running out on my phone. But basically, like, yeah, so much of the point of like Second Temple, previous Judaism rituals and stuff is distancing themselves from polytheistic or like Hanatic worship through some like pretty similar cultural expressions. But ultimately, this point of being holy and other and set apart, like weird paradox of you are gods, you can't be like the other people, and yet you're not quite God. You're both participating in the thing that you cannot be like, also admitting that you can't participate in it. Essentially, that's why it tends to be so legalistic. I think it's kind of stemming from that poor understanding. People don't talk about this a lot, but like Old Testament theology is not really that monotheistic. There are a lot of principalities and stuff spoken of that are like subordinate to like the one, to God. God is seen in a passage of Psalms as ruling among his council of other gods, have in some ways like contradicted him in a sense. So like yeah, you can kind of view like pre-Christian Israelite religion as this very, very like concentrated sense of being set apart and not particular. It's like I don't know, kind of like a devotion to the absolute, particularly, if you will.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, kind of paradoxical. Okay, interesting. I have been seeing more about that, like on Twitter, about how the Old Testament seems to affirm the existence of other gods. A lot of Christians do try to rail against that and basically deem it metaphorical or allegorical. However, let's do a final thoughts thing on the Avatar discussion. And then we will go into more informal. Let's go Karnik. We'll go clockwise this time.
Does that mean me?
Oh yeah, Karnik. Sorry.
Sorry. No, just really good discussion. Definitely, a interesting topic. Really would like to know this because it could be part of how anyone achieves an enlightenment experience. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone's insights on this.
Absolutely, yeah. There is like a subtle relevance here because if there's like conditional proximity, then it has bearing on what you do with your condition, or if that's relevant to the matter at all. I'm not sure if that is the case in Arval's, but I'm going to send this to him. You should too, and yeah, maybe he'll find it interesting. And yeah, raw meat.
Yeah, so we primarily dealt with the avatars in the past. So I would like to bring forth the concept of avatars in the future. I will say off the top of my head, I know in Judaism there's supposed to be a coming Messiah, but also in Catholicism there's supposed to be a Catholic king that actually reclaims the Holy Lands, supposedly, for the Christian peoples.
Indeed, yeah, and isn't in Buddhism, if I'm not mistaken, there's also supposed to be a future Buddha called Maitreya
Correct.
Buddha, right?
Yeah, there's Kalki Maitreya.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yes, future incarnations, current incarnations. Incarnate Chris Langen.
I mean, it was really
Wanderplanets?
interesting. Yeah, about to say, you brought up Adonis, and like, I forget like how mysterious his life was, and like some of the things that happened to him are like extremely larger than life. And if I didn't do the primal diet, I probably would not believe like any of it. But the fact of the matter is that like almost everything, if not everything that he said I've tried is completely true. And even the stuff that he said that I couldn't really prove, like just because of his of how he situated his facts and his knowledge, I probably at this point would believe him that, you know, someone like that, like to have such a traumatic childhood, to have such a traumatic suffering, but for the good of so many people, and potentially many more people, if more people actually like learn about this. And it's quite something that I would akin to, like you were saying, like some type of avatar that is just for the good of like a medicinal value of knowledge.
Indeed, yeah. Indeedly. All right, Celarillin.
I don't really have much to say. It was a lovely discussion. I'm glad I could join, albeit a little late, and partake with you all. Yeah, look forward to maybe making some in the future. Don't have much more formal thoughts or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll give my closing thoughts after. Linda, do you want to have a closing comment? Totally up to you. Yeah, true. I would like for Gyrate to be here. He will be joining in the conversations at some point soon, and yeah, hopefully we can get Arval in. And all right, I'll take this as a closing time. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. It was indeed a very epic conversation. I will post this on my YouTube sometime this week, and we'll go into an informal for anyone who wants to chat. And yeah, thank you for joining. Farewell.